Hey, everybody. Welcome to DCARI's 15th virtual fire investigative training session. Today we have Jeff Pauley, and Jeff is the chairman for the IAAI's Health and Safety Committee. Jeff is located in North Carolina. And today the presentation is going to be on fire investigator health and safety. It's broken down into three parts. There's a lot of really good information in here. We're going to talk about the health and safety issues that fire investigators come across. We'll talk about the research has been done and is going to be done for fire investigators and their health and safety. And then we'll also talk about the best practices moving forward for fire investigators. So strap in. This is going to be a really, really good one. So Jeff, go ahead and take it over.
Excellent, Bill. Thank you very much. Let's start off, folks, with a story. In September of 2014, I was working as a deputy fire marshal in Bedford County, Virginia. And we had a meeting to discuss the upcoming fire recruit training. So there were, 6 or 8 of us in the room. The gentleman you see here in this picture, John Jennings, was our fire marshal. He had retired from the Lynchburg, Virginia Fire Department as a 25+ year fire investigator and was working for us. So he showed up a few minutes late to the meeting, but that was fine. He looked normal. He had no voice. He had lost his voice. He didn't know why at the time. But so we had the meeting. By November of that year, he had been diagnosed with a couple different forms of cancer and was in the hospital. And by February of that year, he had passed. So my goal today is to share information with you that could literally save your life. Because when we know better, we do better, and you don't want to end up like John did, unfortunately. Here are the learning objectives that we're going to cover during this session. As you read through those, let me tell you about the red stars. We're going to cover a lot of information, and to help you, should you take the written test for this session later on, the slides that have a red star on them indicate to you that either material on the slide or material that I talk about could be a part of a future test question. So we're going to talk about the different types of hazards. We're going to talk about indirectly, but we're going to talk about ventilation. We're going to talk about the research studies and then how you can protect yourself. So for some of you, this is going to be a review, but hopefully everyone here will learn some new information. And the goal today is to have you better understand the issues in the post-fire environment. The Everyone Goes Home program covers 16 firefighter life safety initiatives. This is through the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation. This material covers half of those. So it just shows that we're really on track here with what we're talking about. Now, let's put this up front. Some of you are going to listen to this and say, that's a bunch of nonsense. You're not going to buy into some or all the things, honestly, that we're going to talk about today. And I'm okay with that. But my goal at the very least is to plant the seed and have you think about all of these various things. And if I've done that and get you thinking, that's good. And I've achieved my goal. 20-ish years ago, my buddy Mike Donahue, you can read his what he's all about there at the bottom of the slide. He wrote a book on fire investigator health and safety. And you can read his quote here. It's right up at the beginning of the book. I would suggest to you that in some areas, this statement is as true today as it was 20 years ago. And my goal and my committee's goal is to work hard to change that. On January 28th, 1986, 73 seconds after liftoff, the NASA Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. As a result of that, there was a huge inquiry, as I'm sure you can imagine. And as a part of that, Diane Vaughn was a part of the team looking into that, and she came up with this concept on normalization of deviance. Astronaut Mike Mullane did an excellent presentation in 2015 to the annual conference for the International Association of Firefighters. And he talked about this concept of normalization of deviance, because the I'm sorry, I can't even remember the name of it, Thornton Viacol, something like that. Anyhow, the folks that made the engines for the space shuttle, they knew that there were problems with these O-rings, because under certain weather conditions, moisture, low temperature, there could be potential issues. They knew this, but they shot these space shuttles up in the air and nothing happened. So what did that mean to them? It means that, we know about it, but it's not a big deal. So the deviant behavior, allowing these space shuttles to go up, knowing there was a problem, became normalized. His presentation, Mike Mullane's presentation, is now a 4-part YouTube video. And I would highly recommend that you go and you look at that and see what he's got to say. The first 2 sessions are really great, but he talks about, so it's Morton Thiokol. Okay, the BB bounced, Morton Thiokol, they're the ones that made the engines. The problem with this is it leads to what they called predictable surprises. They knew that it was a problem. They could predict and had predicted the problem, but yet they were all shocked and surprised when Challenger blew up. The reason I bring that up is for you to take that concept and think about doing your fire investigations. How many times have you rationalized taking a shortcut? And if you think about that and you can come up with a couple of examples, then the question is, when will the law of averages catch up with you, just like it caught up with them? What we really need is a normalization of compliance. That would be a great concept. So the fundamental question of this entire presentation are called fire scenes safe scenes. We'll talk later about the definition of a cold fire scene. But as you can see in these 2 pictures, here we have a residential structure. You are looking at the CD corner. There was a deck on the Charlie side of the CD corner, which is now a bunch of rubbish. The fire started outside on that deck, extended to the structure and did extensive damage, partly because it was in a rural setting and there was an extended response time for the fire department. The picture on the right, though, is the front door of that structure on the alpha side, obviously. So directly opposite. But you can see the extensive damage that was done in there. Now, these photos were taken several days after the fire. So it's a cold fire scene, right? So that means that no PPE of any kind is needed, especially respiratory protection, because it's cold fire, right? Well, at the end of this, I certainly hope that and my goal is for you to know the correct answer to that question. So we're going to start with level setting to make sure that we're all on the same page regarding the post-fire hazards. And fundamentally, whether you work on a team of 10 or by yourself, you need to understand and follow the scene safety basics. There are 3 broad categories of hazards: physical and environmental, even though that's 2 words, that's 1 category; biologic and toxic. These are in 921. These are in our best practices document. And we're going to talk about them in this today. We'll briefly address the first 2 because they can usually be mitigated. And then we're going to drill down and focus on the various toxic hazards. I'm not a big fan of reading slides to you. If I do that, it must mean that there's something really important. I'm hoping that while I'm speaking, you're reading the slides. Do want to point out to you that with a few exceptions, every photograph that you see in this presentation are photos that I personally took. And so while you read this list of some of the physical environmental hazards that one might encounter during a fire investigation, let me take a moment to tell you about this very interesting photo here. So this incident occurred on a weekday morning at about between 5 and 5:30 a.m. And essentially the road curved, and for whatever reason, the driver chose to go straight. And he ran into what had been a residential structure that was about 100 yards off the road. And thankfully, nobody was in it. It was being converted. It was in the process of being converted to offices for a nonprofit. The post-collision, the driver was ejected out the front windshield of the truck. He was unbelted, unfortunately, and was located several hours later in the basement. Good joint investigative response here. The state police handled the crash. We handled the fire. It was packaged very nicely. And as you can imagine, this elicited a huge fire department response. So these are, this photo, though, I like because it exemplifies many of these physical environmental hazards. You have fuel leaks, you had wires down, all sorts of good things. But most of this stuff can be mitigated by good PPE use. Then we have biological hazards. Some are listed here. Nice big word there, histoplasmosis. It's a lung infection from inhaling fungal spores from the droppings of bats and birds. Okay, you're doing a abandoned structure or a barn or something like that, this can be a hazard. The last item, mold, which is highlighted, I do want to spend a minute on, because any fire scene that's more than 48 hours, give or take, old, any level of moisture, where's the moisture come from? The fire folks putting the wet stuff on the red stuff, right? And a food source, and I'm not talking about bread necessarily, but it can be, but sheetrock, clothing, carpeting, bed covers, all of those are a food source for mold. If those three criteria are met, time, moisture, food source, mold will be present. You can see it in this picture some. I'm sure some of you have seen it a lot more. According to Dr. Nancy Burton, who is the NIOSH mold expert, there have not been a lot of studies on the long-term health effects of mold. So we don't know what we don't know, right? But short-term, especially if you have existing respiratory issues, COPD, asthma, things like this, will exacerbate those problems. Again, PPE can help you. So then we have the big boy in the room, the toxic hazards. Come in a variety of flavors. Clearly, the contents of fire smoke, organic vapors, acid gases, particulates, those are the big three. Vapors are a gaseous form of a substance which is normally solid or in a liquid state at room temperature and pressure. They're formed by the evaporation from a liquid or solid and can be found where parts cleaning, painting takes place, where solvents are used. On the other hand, gases are a formless fluid that expand to occupy space or enclosure in which they're confined. An example is hydrogen sulfide, which is formed whenever there's decomposition of materials containing sulfur under reducing conditions, which includes fires, obviously. And so the challenge here is that these harmful chemical compounds that can be in the form of solids or liquids, gas, all this exert toxic effects by inhalation and absorption, and can be in varying concentrations in the post-fire environment, near term and long term. And we need to be aware of this, and we need to protect ourselves for it. So let's drill down on this just a little bit. So here's a definition of gases and some examples, definition of vapors and some examples, and aerosols. We're going to talk more about aerosols later, but aerosol does not mean it's a vapor or gas. It includes other things. More on that in a little bit, but need to know what the difference is. So gas production starts very early in the combustion process. Conditions of high temperature and low oxygen can enhance the degradation of synthetics, which then quickens their chemical release and provides for the toxic composition of not only the smoke, based on these various factors here that you see listed, but a wide number of different factors that come into play that all affect what you may or may not be breathing later down the road. So what does all that mean for us? We know that all fire investigators, not just in the public sector, but every fire investigator needs to understand what the hazard potentials are to them. And they're twofold, right? Exposure to toxic gases, we don't know how long they last. We'll touch more on that, but we don't know how long they last in the post-fire environment. But they can usually be mitigated with proper PPE use. But there's also a high exposure potential to particulates through inhalation and absorption, and they can also be contaminated with gas molecules. And that just means that you have to use proper PPE all the time in the post-fire environment. So why is this different for us? You know, my buddy John, who I showed you there, when he first started doing fire investigations, probably 20, 30, 35 years ago, things were a little bit different. But over the last few decades, the man-made products have changed. The modern built environment, as opposed to the older traditional methods, has resulted in the use of more cost-effective materials and synthetics, which is fine, but those can also increase fire spread, decrease time to flashover, and put a lot more bad stuff into the post-fire environment. So here's just a nice definition for you of respiratory or breathing hazard. This includes gases and particulates, right? And using this as an intro, as you read this, to get going and discussing in particular the hazards for gases and particulates in greater detail. So here are just some of the sources of toxic gases resulting from all these construction changes over the last couple of decades. It is a very long list. This is just a quick intro to you to see what things are in today's as-built environment that can be a hazard to you. And here's just a partial list of fire-produced gases. Most of these are known carcinogens. Unfortunately, the full effects of some of these are not yet fully understood and known to us. And there can be other substances as well that we're just not familiar with. A study that we're going to talk about here in a bit from Tualatin Valley, Oregon in 2011 identified some new substances such as mercury and arsenic and ozone that were previously not well understood in the post-fire environment. So there is some work going on in that regard, which is good. But toxicologists remind us that exposure to even trace levels of harmful chemicals is not good for us. And then you have what they call a synergistic effect, where multiple chemicals in the same environment can work together synergistically, right? They work together to be even more harmful than they would be by themselves. That does not bode well for us. So while there are well over 100 harmful chemicals, we're going to talk about these two to get us all on the same page. And these two are particularly important, especially to the public fire investigators, because they are detectable and they are treatable. It's important to note here that up to this point, there have been no studies whatsoever of post-fire scene latency. In other words, how long do these gases and vapors, particularly gases, persist in the post-fire environment? Working on it, but nothing yet. So just briefly to get us all on the same page here, carbon monoxide, right? You can read about this here. The right side of that talks about COHB levels. So COHB is carboxyhemoglobin. It's a stable complex of carbon monoxide and hemoglobin, which is in your blood. And this is what forms in your body in contact with the post-fire environment. So that's not good. So generally speaking, 50% is a level that's widely considered to be the benchmark of concentration that's fatal. Levels lower than that can also result in death, and that's not good. And levels down to 30% can start to incapacitate you. So that's not good. So carbon monoxide becomes fatal by creating a systemic hypoxia. You can see the different levels here. Bad stuff, but it's detectable and treatable, and that's good. Hydrogen cyanide, same thing, right? It's formed from heated nitrogen. It is released in large quantities, especially in smoldering fires. The quantity of it can be enhanced by certain characteristics that you can see there. What's important here that I want to point out to you, inhaled, we all get that, right? But it also can be through dermal absorption through your skin and ocular absorption through your eyeballs and the membranes. That is not good. You need to protect yourself from that. We're going to talk about that, right? It's also important to understand that off-gassing can continue for some time post-exposure. So if you're a public fire investigator and you're at the scene of a working structure fire and you're interviewing the first in search crew, for example, and you're standing right next to them, their PPE, their structural PPE is off-gassing. And you're breathing that stuff in and you're absorbing, as is everybody else around. Not good. Need to be aware of that. So hydrogen cyanide is produced during combustion of nitrogen-based materials. We've talked about this briefly: wool, nylon, plastics, all these things that are commonly found in household furniture and interior finishes. That means there is a lot of it in the fire environment, the near term post-fire environment. Now, what's interesting is that you're not going to be able to detect it unless you've got metering to do that. But in acute exposures, it's much more toxic to you than carbon monoxide is. So we talk about LC50, which is lethal concentration, 50, which is the concentration that kills 50% of the test animals, usually mice, in a given time period, which is usually 4 hours. So that's LC50. And you can see here what the part per million breakdown is. That's likely going to kill you, which is not good. So a variation of that is we have these cyanide releasing polymers. They're not good for you either, right? Because they burn faster, they give off all this bad stuff. And we see larger amounts of it in smoldering fires. So here's just a quick comparison between the two. And again, over 100 cancer-causing chemicals in post-fire gases. We're just talking about these two. Why? Because they're detectable and treatable. We know that these two are present at every fire. Many of the others are also, but we know that these are. But we don't know how long they persist, and that's important to you. A lot of these gases contain per and polyfluoral alkyl substances. Some of these are cancer causing. Some of these are contained in firefighting foam. If you as a fire investigator are not asking your firefighters whether or not they used foam, and if they say yes, which kind, you need to be doing that, because Class B foams may contain a substance of PFAS. Another thing that has become more interesting and important to us is the presence of Teflons. It's not just in kitchen fires, although that's a good place to find it. Teflon is contained in a lot of different things, in electronics, commercial wiring, in commercial structure fires can have Teflon coatings. And as my friend Dr. Calkins here points out, we don't know what all is in the post-fire environment. There's a lot of bad stuff there. We don't know how those bad things combine to form other bad combination substances. So the toxic gas issues are present and they persist through the post-fire environment. So while we've talked about carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide, you need to understand that there's no correlation whatever between any readings that you may get on multi-gas detectors that you may be using. There's no correlation between A and B or these two and any other substance. What you do need to know is it's really the dose that matters. Whether you have a large dose, a short duration, a small dose, a longer duration, it all can be bad for you under certain conditions. So we're all familiar with, I would imagine, the Station nightclub fire back in 2003, February 20th. We just had the anniversary of it, West Warwick, Rhode Island. Started from onstage pyrotechnics, killed 100 people. But what's interesting is the folks at NIST have one of, and there's several of these around the US, only a handful, but they have a very large test building facility. ATF has one, and I believe there's a private insurance company that has another one. I think those are the only 3 in the US. Anyhow, they rebuilt the entire structure from the station nightclub. And then they set it on fire using the same methodology. And as you can see here, untenable conditions from gases after 90 seconds, which tells you that there's some really bad stuff that's going on in the fire environment, and this stuff persists into the post-fire environment. Well, that's great. We can use these detectors to figure them out, right, and see what is what, but we need to understand that there are limitations. They can give you a false sense of security. And one of the ways that occurs is there's a minimum threshold for your alert sensor. So if you have your meter set to for HCN at 4.9 parts per million, for example, you could be in 4.75 all day long. That's not a big difference. You're still in a hazardous environment and you're still putting bad stuff into you. Smaller amount, longer duration leads to bad. There can be cleaning calibration issues, as we talk about. Sorry about that. But they're good. If you have them, use them. But please understand that there are limitations. So let's talk about aerosols. So here's the NIOSH definition. Inhalation is bad. Dermal contact on your skin is bad. But you need to understand that these are liquids and solids. So here's a nice list of different types. The one in blue towards the bottom of the slide is most relevant to what we do. You need to understand while you're looking through this list that the size and the shape of the aerosol compound can affect where it's deposited and how it will affect you and how it will interact with your body. If it's inhaled, obviously the amount that's inhaled affects the toxicity of it, and should also go without saying that the longer it is inhaled, the worse the effects are going to be. And as we talked about previously, I can't stress enough that concurrent exposures to other bad things, other toxic agents, can increase the effects of the exposure to these things. So here's the problem for fire investigators. Well, it's important to know about the gases and vapors. Most of those are going to dissipate over time. Now, what we don't know is what is trapped in fire debris. So you go to a fire a day later, 2 days later, whatever, and you've got 18 inches of debris that you're going to dig through to get down to the floor so you can see patterns. What are you releasing into the atmosphere when you dig? We don't know the answer to that. Regardless, particulate matter, guess what we're getting ready to talk about next, huh? It remains until the scene is cleaned up, demolished, gone, covered up, whatever. They do not go away. So here's a great word, nanoparticulates. We got regular particulates, we got the nanos. And nanos are the ones that you need to understand and know about, because those are the ones that can mess you up. My friend Pete Mancy, some of you may know Pete. He knows that I tell this story. He's okay with me telling this story. Retired from London Fire Brigade after many years of running their fire investigation unit. Anyhow, he and I are having a conversation a couple of years ago about particulates. And He says, before I knew better, I would go to a fire scene. I'd shine my flashlight down into the interior of the structure, down the hallway, whatever. And if I didn't see any particulates floating in the air, I didn't wear a respirator because it was fine. It was a good, clean scene. That is very untrue. And he knows that now. And I appreciate that he shared that story with me, because many of us have done the same thing. And my primary goal here with this training is for you to understand how bad that can be for you. So the nanos are around, and nanos are not good. So here's I think this is a NIOSH diagram, but it shows you visually what we're talking about here. So a micron is an abbreviated term for micrometer, which is a millionth of a meter. So here where you see PM10, that means particulate matter that's 10 microns or less. Above that, PM 2.5 means that it's particulate matter 2.5 microns or less. So when compared to the human hair or the grain of sand, you can see here visually the small, fine nanoparticulates that we're talking about. They're commonly generated through combustion or by secondary gas to particle reactions, and they are bad for you. They're typically rich in carbon nitrates, sulfates, and ammonium ions. So here's some data. This information comes from Professor John Cimbala from Penn State University, and he does a nice breakdown of particulate sizes. So the bigger stuff, greater than 10 microns, usually get trapped in the parts of your respiratory tract that are designed to do just that. Cilia in your throat, nasal hairs. This is why, hopefully in the old days, we're not seeing this now, but we may be. When you left the fire scene, you blow your nose and you're getting all the black gunk. That's because these larger particles were blocked. So then you've got the under 10, but greater than 2.5. They can get into your lungs. Then the smaller ones get all the way down into the deepest depths of your lungs. And then you've got the really small ones, right? Less than 1 micron. Now, what's interesting here is this 10-ish year old study from Underwriter Laboratories. And they were doing atmospheric sampling during overhaul, right? The fire's extinguished. The firefighters are doing overhaul to get out the hot spots. This is not post-fire, but it's very emblematic of post-fire, because the important thing is that they found that 99+%, so virtually all of the particles less than 1 micron. And as you can see here, and the blue is from Dr. Cimbala again, the average person, you can see down to about 70. Sometimes you can, under certain conditions, you can see down to 10. You cannot see the 2.5s, the 1s, all the little stuff. So the 99% of what UL is saying is 1 micron or smaller, you cannot see that. So you go back to my friend Pete's story. It's admirable that he was checking, but it would be impossible, as we now know, for him to see these nanoparticulates in the post-fire environment. So here's a nice diagram of things within the respiratory tract of the human body. And it, as we said, and logic tells us that generally speaking, the smaller the particulate size, the deeper into the lungs it can go. And the more likely it is to get into down into the alveoli, where you have the transfer of things in your lungs into your body, into your bloodstream. The interior surface of each lung is about 100 square meters. That's a lot of area. That is a lot of area to get nanoparticulates into the deep parts of your lungs and adversely affect your body. So let's look at one specific likely component of particulate matter, and that is lead dust. You see a list of the building products that may contain lead. You see a list of household items that can contain lead. Not a complete list by any means, but all of these can be found in today's homes and probably many businesses too. Well, why do we care about that? So the reason we care is that lead vaporizes at about 932 degrees Fahrenheit. The average structure fire is a whole lot hotter than that. So the lead is vaporizing. It is contained in the fire smoke that is coming off of the structure fire. And when that smoke cools, it condenses and turns into particulate matter, including nanoparticulates. So if you're not wearing, and remember, particulates persist through the post-fire scene and environment, right? So if you're not wearing PPE and you're getting particulate matter on your person, on your clothing, you're taking this home with you. Well, the problem with lead dust in particular is that when it's absorbed into your body thinks it's calcium. So instead of saying, oh, stop, we don't want you in here, we're going to try to expel you, calcium is good. It says, come on in. And the problem with that is that low levels of lead have been linked scientifically to central nervous system damage and other health issues in unborn children, infants, and young children up to about 8 or 10 years old. Not a line in the sand by any means, but young children, infants, unborns. So if you have these little people at home, or you are expecting a little person, and you're taking this particulate matter home, which likely includes lead dust, not good. Not good for your family. So what happens when something bad happens? So you should all understand the difference between acute and chronic. Acute means it happens right now, which, you know, you cut yourself, you fall and break your leg, whatever. Chronic means it is building up and happening over time, right? If we're talking specifically about exposures to the hazards that we've been talking about so far today, an acute exposure can be considered a high concentration over a short period, and a chronic is a lower concentration over a more extended period, which means you go to 27 fires over the course of a year and expose yourself to the same thing each 27 times. That's not good, right? After the lungs, we talked about the skin is the body's second largest organ and area. It is highly absorptive. Some areas of the skin are more permeable than others. the face, under your jaw, the neck and throat area, and the groin are particularly susceptible to dermal absorption. Slide talks about inhalation and absorption. In the case of what you are breathing into your lungs, you are inhaling it, but at the end of the day, the little nanos that are getting all the way down into the alveoli are being absorbed into your bloodstream. So it's technically absorption, but we are inhaling the stuff. The big issue here, the great variable, as the slide says, is individual susceptibility. Differences in gender, in weight, age, hormones, genetic sequence, all these things can all affect the manifestation of toxicity in any person. And this is why it's important to protect yourself, because you don't know what your factors are. You and I could start on the job today, go to every fire together, do all the work together. 20 years from now, one of us has cancer and one of us does not. You cannot predict this. You cannot predict the effect of how these things are going to happen to you. So if you don't protect yourself adequately, then you're getting behind the 8 ball real quick. Genetics, lifestyle choices, environmental factors can all play a role, sometimes a significant role, in initiating the cancer sequence in your body. The post-fire scene is an environmental factor that you can control to a great extent to reduce occupational toxic exposures. Having good lifestyle choices can make things even better still. The slide talks about the University of Miami wristband study. We're going to talk about that at greater length, but we're starting to see multiple known and presumed cancer-causing substances in the post-fire environment, and that's not good. So here's a fancy word, pharmacokinetics, how things happen. So all of these gas, vapor, particulates are toxicants, which means they're substances producing an adverse biological effect. So this is the process that you see here, 4-step process of moving any of these toxicants, drugs, if you will, but toxicants, into, through, and out of the body. These are the 4 cornerstones of the process. And how this works with each different person is unique to that person. And so what works for you and what affects you in one way may work for me and affect me in another way. And last but not least, we have another important variable here. So leukemias can appear in as little as 3 years. Lung cancer, as an example, can take as long as 30 years to appear. The association between risk factors and human disease are exceedingly complex, and there are diverse exposure scenarios. Many factors come into play. In some instances, an increased dose can lead to a shorter period before tumors appear or to a greater number of tumors. You just don't know. So the point of all of this is for you to understand that there are a lot of factors and variables in play regarding the toxicity of a post-fire scene. But the bottom line is that every scene is potentially dangerous to you and to everyone else who is there. And that in order to protect yourself and your loved ones, you need to take precautions. So if you remember nothing else, and you will see the slide again, the hazards present at most every fire scene and hazards that you cannot see can kill you at some point in the future. So let's talk for a couple of minutes about some just general fire research. One of the problems that we have as fire investigators is that up to now, or up to very recently, when the big red trucks left the fire scene, or whatever color in your environment, the research stopped. The research money stopped. That paradigm is starting to shift, but right now we have to, in large part, rely on general fire research and extrapolate that information into our environment. So one of the earliest studies was done by the Phoenix Fire Department. They determined that vapors may use airborne breathable particulates as an entry vehicle into firefighters' lungs. Based on what we just talked about, that should key something for you into how that translates to fire investigators. They found that maximum concentrations of some contaminants can exceed occupational exposure limits. And they found that adverse health effects may occur from exposure to a mixture of products, even if the individual components were below exposure limits. Back to that synergistic effect where the combining of ingredients presents a greater hazard than the individuals. So here you can just see some of the bulleted conclusions from their studies. One of the things that they called out was that if post-fire fuels are still off-gassing, SCBA needs to be used. There are agencies today, public agencies today, not many, but significant ones, who wear SCBA during the entire fire investigation process. In 2007, the Firefighter Safety Research Institute, which is part of Underwriter Laboratories, along with Chicago Fire Department and the University of Cincinnati, did some test burns and burned off some real buildings. The detected gases, chemicals, particulates were then assessed by the University of Cincinnati's College of Medicine for their potential adverse health effects. So they found that the concentration of combustion products varied tremendously from fire to fire, depending on a lot of different factors, right? The chemistry of the materials, ventilation, size of the structure, but a lot of different factors that they were looking at here. They found that the combustion of the materials generated asphyxiants, irritants, airborne carcinogenic byproducts that could be potentially debilitating to firefighters. Well, if they are to firefighters, trust me, they are to the fire investigators also. And multiple asphyxiants, irritants, and carcinogenic materials were found in smoke during both suppression and overhaul phases, because that's where the research stops, right at the end of overhaul. They also found that carcinogenic chemicals may act topically following inhalation or subsequently through dermal absorption from contaminated equipment, and that long-term repeated exposure may accelerate cardiovascular mortality and the initiation and or progression of atherosclerosis. Okay. A little while after that, Columbia, South Carolina Fire Department did a study. Some of you may know Jason Cruzen. Jason was then the captain of this citywide heavy rescue. I believe he is now retired from there and is working somewhere else. But they went to a bunch of fires. The most important thing here, as you can see, is that they found no correlation between CO and HCN readings. We talked about that earlier. One doesn't have anything to do with the other. Now, what's interesting about this, and if you've heard Jason speak, he may have told this story, but of one of these 40 fires that they went to, their crew was taking a break. They're leaning on the front bumper of their squad truck, and they were about 100 or so feet away from the fire. The fire was a garden style apartment building, and they were well away. The wind shifted, their detectors started going off. So you never know, just because you think you are out of the warm zone does not necessarily mean that you are. There is a little bit of fire investigator specific research. And the first of those, so back in the day, NIOSH was the investigative arm for ATF. So back in 96, 97, so ATF posed a question to NIOSH regarding exposure of irritants and what the effects were on fire investigators. So they came up with 4 recommendations. You can see them here. I would suggest to you that there are some agencies today and some companies today who are not aware of and or are not following these recommendations from 25-ish years ago. The study and these recommendations are referenced in NFPA 921, Chapter 13. But there are some problems with that even today. About 10 years later, same process occurred, right? The question here, the research question here was apparel that ATF agents, fire investigators were wearing at the post-fire scene and cleaning them. Again, 4 recommendations. Again, addressed in 921. And again, I would suggest that some of these are not being followed today. In about 2011, a Phoenix fire investigator by the name of Willie Nelson, not the singer. Willie has now retired from Phoenix Fire, but he was doing a graduate level college class and did a study with an industrial hygienist, Dawn Bolstad Johnson, who's written a great book out in the last year or so called Exposed. She does not know that I'm aware of that I talk about her book, but while it talks mostly about the firefighter environment, there's stuff that can be well extrapolated out for fire investigators. Good book. Anyhow, she and Willie did this project. You can read the results here, or the design of the study. They found that ventilation was a factor, but it really depends. And the bottom line here is that every scene is different. And so they found that time by itself was not a good factor. Right? As you can see here, high levels of formaldehyde were at one scene 3 days after. You just don't know. Every scene is different. You cannot say that because this was a little room and contents fire that the hazard is low, or because this was a full structure on the ground, it's higher. You can see the factors that he found in his study. And at the end of the day, ventilation may help with gases. It does not help with particulates. Particulate matter the nanos in particular, persist throughout the scene. They stay there until it's all cleaned up. We talked earlier about the Tualatin Valley Fire and Rescue Study. They did a really nice study about 10 years ago now in conjunction with the State of Oregon Governor's Fire Service Policy Council. And just to quote from that, it said, the intro of that, it says, this study focused on the direct reading of gases present during overhaul, the measurement of these gases over an extended period of time in comparison to CO, and on the compilation of data to support and continue the understanding of post-fire event airborne hazards to firefighters and fire investigators. Towards the end of that, page 23, to be specific, there are specific recommendations for fire investigators. You can see those recommendations here. Last but not least, we have this ATF study. This has been going on for a long time and is still continuing. The report that was issued in 2012 highlights some of the issues here, which you can read, but this is still an ongoing study. And out of the 7 individuals that had bladder cancer, 6 of them had assignments associated with post-fire scene examinations. Talks about inhalation and absorption, and it talks about exposure maybe greater during post-fire investigation than during suppression. That's important information, not because there's a red star on this slide, but important also for you to understand to help you live a long and healthy life. So what's all this tell us? Here's a summary of the findings to date. There's a high risk of exposure to us in the post-fire environment. We don't know how long the hazards persist. We know that ventilation is good, but it is not going to make everything go away. It is not going to make particulate matter go away. And if you remember nothing else, please remember that those particulates persist. Particulates persist. So there is some work being done to look at the post-fire environment with regards to us, the fire investigators. So I want to touch briefly on those 4. My buddy Pete Mancy, who we talked about earlier, is this was in process. It's on a COVID suspension, but it'll get back in. But they're looking at particulate filters. So in the UK, a P3 filter is the same as what we call a P100. And if you don't understand what that means, we'll get to that here eventually. But fire investigators are wearing a new particulate filter. At one fire, they fill out a little 1-page questionnaire. It gets mailed off to the university, and grad students and strong microscopes are counting the number of particulates and then comparing that information to others. So that document that they fill out talks about the type of fire, how long you were in the scene, what type of scene, et cetera. The University of Miami, we're going to talk about their wristband study. They are one of the lead organizations with the firefighter cancer cohort study, along with NIOSH and the University of Arizona. So those are the 3 main players. But they are looking at the persistence of post-fire scene gases. More on that in a moment. The 4 pictures here are all from Underwriter Laboratories, because those fine folks, they got a grant from the federal government to do 20 test burns, looking at other stuff that doesn't really apply to what we're talking about here today. But through conversations with them, they decided to take a subset of those, instrument them to detect for gases and particulates. You can see the instrumentation in the upper left and the lower right, pre-fire upper left, post-fire lower right. So most of these structures, there are two identical ones. The photo in the upper right is one of the two. They're right next to each other at the facility in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. And they burned them. So I think it's 5 of them. They boarded up and let sit for 3 or 4 days afterwards and measured the levels of gases and particulates. Now, this is one of the first looks that we're seeing, along with the University of Miami stuff that we'll come back to, with regards to the persistence of gases in the post-fire environment. Now, UL is looking at particulates. The variable that we don't have in this experiment is what happens to those levels of particulates when somebody goes in and walks through the scene, just to take a couple of pictures, or goes in and digs out the scene. So I'm hoping that we can do something later on with them to get that. But this is going to give us a good look at gases, particulates in the post-fire environment. The last one here on this list, which is just getting underway, and it's a multi-year project with NC State University and the Fire Protection Research Foundation, which is the part of NFPA. It's a 3-year project to look at 2 things. One, to look at the protective qualities of various clothing ensembles that fire investigators wear, and an independent look at how good these various decon wipes are that are out on the market. There is 0 currently independent research regarding the efficiency, effectiveness of these wipes. Some of the companies do their own. They may be telling the story in the light most favorable to them. So this is an independent, this is an AFG funded independent look at all of the decon wipes that are out there. Good stuff, specifically having to do with fire investigators. So we're starting to change the paradigm here on research. In particular, I want to talk to you about this University of Miami wristband study. Public and private fire investigators, it started a year and a half or so ago. What they found was these silicone wristbands that various entities use for fundraisers and support this cause, that cause. That material effectively absorbs the post-fire environment gases and can be analyzed. Who would have thought that? Now, we've got a bunch of public and private fire investigators who've been wearing these at specific scenes. You put it on, you don't want to put it on your wrist, but you put it someplace where it's exposed, attached to your helmet. It doesn't matter where. It gets exposed in the post-fire environment. You put it back in the container, seal it up, fill out a short questionnaire, it goes to the lab. Now, before COVID locked everything down, they were able to analyze 10. I know that's a small sample. They've done many more. The results they're still working on. So the best I can tell you about right now is the first 10, but they are getting caught up. We're hoping that the program gets expanded this year and there are more fire investigators wearing, public and private, wearing these in the post-fire environment. But of the 10 that they looked at, as you can see here, the prelim results, naphthalene which is possibly carcinogenic based on IARC, possibly carcinogenic to humans. It was in every one. 7 known classified carcinogens were detected. It's starting to give us data to support the highly suspected hazards in the post-fire environment. So as this continues to roll out and we learn more and more, it's going to start giving us a much clearer picture of the health hazards in the post-fire environment. Great work that these folks are doing. So what's all this mean to us? We know that fire investigators are, first of all, typically have more fires than firefighters. We're typically there for a longer time. And sadly, we're oftentimes less well protected than the firefighters. That's not good. The problem is that there's this mindset amongst a lot of fire investigators that cold scene is a safe scene. Hoping you're not thinking that by now. That I'm not exposed to anything. It hasn't hurt me yet. So what's the deal? Well, we know why that is, right? Latency. Yeah, barring anything acute happening, it's not going to hurt you a short time. And because there's no acute systems, people think that everything's okay. It's hard to explain and get folks to understand that these hazards build up in you over many years. But the bottom line is the fire scenes of today are different than the fire scenes of earlier. We need to change things. That's why we're doing this training. That's why we are getting this message out, because we need to change the culture of fire investigators to understand the hazards and recognize and deal with and protect themselves. There are still a lot of issues that need to be studied and looked at, but we're starting to see how things are looking. And that leads us to public or private, it doesn't matter. Unlike what Mike Donahue said earlier, that it's the least dealt with subject, we need to bring health and safety for fire investigators to the forefront with agencies, companies, all these employers. And it needs to be a priority, because at the end of the day, who's responsible? You are. And you need to protect yourself, but that needs to be supported by the employers, whether you're working for yourself, with your friend, or a company with 1,000 fire investigators. It doesn't matter. We recognize that sometimes it's difficult to take preventive actions now for something that is seemingly benign and may not impact you for 30 plus years. I get that. But the message is clear and the message is strong that we need to do something to protect ourselves. So what can you do? Well, you can accept, you can identify, you can develop, and you can read this stuff here. You have to do something, whether your agency or your company is doing it, you're doing it, somebody needs to be doing it. And you are the best person to help yourself. I was not in the Navy, but I've been told that an aircraft carrier traveling at what I believe they call flank speed, cruising speed, takes about 5 miles to make a 90-degree turn left or right. That also takes time, right? We need to shift the paradigm. We need to make the turn towards understanding, recognizing, and dealing with the hazards in the post-fire environment. We need to do something. My favorite phrase there is at the bottom: when we know better, we need to do better. This is how we grow better fire investigators, ones who can enjoy a long and healthy retirement, by getting them to understand. Now, for those who have been doing this for a number of years, maybe the die is cast. Maybe it's not because of individual susceptibility, right? We talked about, but at the very least, you can set a positive example for the folks just coming in or who have recently just come in to fire investigations so that they are led by positive example. And that's as important as protecting yourself. So how do we do that? You need to understand and follow safety practices. We're getting to that point where we're going to talk about that. Using time and ventilation to your advantage is good, but we still need to protect ourselves. Why? Because some hazards persist. Detectors are good as long as you understand their limitations. The bottom line is proper PPE. Appropriate respiratory practices, stop and dermal exposure to the greatest extent possible. Each fire investigator has to assess the hazards of each scene and choose the proper PPE based on that assessment. Can you have an overabundance of caution? Absolutely. Can you take reasonable precautions to protect yourself? Absolutely. In order to protect yourself, you need to know about these various subjects here. And we're going to talk about, for the remainder of our time together, what you need to know to help protect yourself. For those of you who are following NFPA or have read 1033, if your agency subscribes to it, you're required to follow, there are shall statements in 1033, which means you have to do, right? Talks about scene safety assessments, regional and national safety standards, policies and procedures. Hopefully your agency has those if those apply. Even if 1033 does not apply to your agency legally, you should still be following it. I will say that this edition, now 2014 is the current edition. There's one coming out soon. Their appendix points to a reference document from 1994. I would suggest to you strongly that a lot has changed since then. And I'm happy to tell you that that will be deleted in the next edition. We should all be familiar with this little document here. Much of what we're going to talk about going forward is included in chapter 13, which is the safety chapter. I will sad to say that there were no substantive changes from the 14 edition to the 21 edition. Just a few technical changes. And sadly, it says absolutely nothing about some very important subjects, such as filter and cartridge types. We're going to talk about that. So the bottom line here is you need to understand the hazards at every post-fire scene. Essentially, you need to approach them as a hazmat incident. Now, the problem with that, if you are familiar with the HAZWOPER standards within the OSHA regulations, if we were to declare every fire scene a hazmat scene, that would be extremely problematic because there's all sorts of federal regulations and things that need to come into play. I'm not suggesting we do that. I'm not suggesting that, as the photo on the right shows, that you wear level A suits at every fire scene. But by the same token, the folks on the left are grossly underprepared. There are folks today who are going into fire scenes like these guys. So somewhere in between, these photos show two extremes. But where in this timeline of examples are you? Are you adequately preparing yourself? So we're going to watch a video. As you can see here, this video was recorded specifically for our presentations that IAAI does. It's about 11 minutes, but it is an important message. So I hope you listen up and pay attention.
Hello, my name's David Creasy. I'm a retired senior battalion chief from the Chesterfield Fire Department. I'm also retired from the city of Richmond, where I was fire marshal for just about 10 years. I'm here today to talk very briefly about my dealings with cancer and how it's affected me. I've spent 23 of my 50 years of service managing and conducting fire investigations. So I have quite a bit of experience and exposure to fire scenes over my career. I'm past board member of the Virginia chapter of the IAAI, and I also served for several years as the training committee chairman. In June 2014, I was having what was thought to be a pneumonia attack, and I ended up in the hospital. And when the radiologist came out, they said, you don't have pneumonia, but you have cancer. This hit me like a stone because I had no signs, no symptoms related to the cancer. I had no pain. So it was quite a surprise to me at that point. They brought in an oncologist, and the oncologist said that I had a neuroendocrine cancer, which was on my liver, and I had 25 tumors on my liver. 25 tumors, and I didn't have any signs nor symptoms. At that point, they told me they could not do any operating, no transplants, that it was terminal, and they gave me about a year to live. I immediately started out with chemo and putting a port in and some other tests being conducted the next day. So I knew it was bad when they rushed everything around, and you probably understand hospitals don't move too fast. Well, this one did. I took a very positive approach to this. While I certainly wasn't happy, it wasn't anything I could do about it. I've loved the fire service since the day I started, and it's just the price you pay when we're exposed to some of the carcinogens and toxic gases out on the fire scene. Right now, I'm approaching 4 years since that day, and it's kind of funny in a way that this has gone on now for 4 years. It's given me plenty of time to go out and talk to people about cancer and firefighting and suggest ways to avoid some of the problem areas. I did have a physical, strangely enough. I did have a physical in February of 2014 that did not show any cancer. However, I must say that the physical may not have actually tested for cancer. So I had the company physical in February, and in May they found 25 tumors on my liver. Neuroendocrine cancer is not covered under the Virginia cancer presumptive law. So we were not able to get any assistance from the state to help us with the cost. The costs are very high, and even with my regular insurance, we were paying anywhere from $5,000 to $8,000 a month. And that's a quick way to drain your retirement, your savings, and with a little help out there for us. So we were spending money like it was growing on trees. The one thing I should have done and didn't do, and I highly suggest that you do, is you get a cancer insurance policy. You can get it in many different designs, but basically you get that insurance policy, they will pay and take care of most of the bills. We had a fellow firefighter in the city of Richmond who had leukemia, which is certainly a little different, but he had a cancer policy and he paid actually zero on any of the bills that came in, and he also got a clean bill of health in about 2 years. Cancer takes over your life. It's a new life once you're diagnosed. It's not always fun. In fact, that the medicine that they give you, the chemo or whatever they may have you on, because you're usually going to be on several medicines, are have various side effects. The biggest thing I see is fatigue, and the chemo would knock me down when I'd start that, and and I was very weak and lost strength to do things. So I was at the mercy of chemo in my new life. We were able to get the tumor count down from 25 to 23 over the next year. The doctor said that that's wonderful, but understand that the cancer will be back. We can't tell you when, and we can't tell you where. Well, so I started in 2014. In 2016, it did show back up in some scans we did, and it moved from my liver to my hips, to my back, and to my right femur. And so we started with chemo again and basically started the process over again. One thing I will say, my doctor is really great, and she is hooked up with Johns Hopkins, so any testing and research they were doing, we were able to take advantage of. And right now I'm on a break because my cancer has not moved, it has not grown over the last 3 months. So we think the combination of chemos that we've been taking are in fact good for my particular cancer, and is something that we can go back to because we're looking at alternatives medicine at this time, and we're going to see how that goes. I do believe my cancer came from dermal absorption. I worked a lot of fire scenes in a t-shirt and no turnout gear, and there was still some smoke, toxic gases, carcinogens being put off in the house or around the house, and I was exposing myself to that. So I really feel like with the amount of years I have that's what's happened. You have to change the way you think about cancer. Cancer is now the leading cause of firefighter deaths. It has surpassed heart attacks. And a lot of it is permanent, just like my cancer is. So you basically take treatment to buy you a little more time. So you have to start looking at things different and carefully prioritize as a fire department what you may need to purchase, implement in your operations to try to help and prevent the cancer actually being taken in by individuals, not just in fire investigations, but also in firefighting. There are plenty of guides out that you can choose to help you set up policies, and there are several departments out there that have policies that are willing to share. Keep in mind that cancer is not like a cold. It's not here for a week or two and then it's gone. Cancer is a devastating disease that may not go away until you go away. So you really have to take that preventative approach to cancer, and you also need to keep a very positive outlook during your treatment. The biggest thing is for you not to become a statistic. We want to implement positive and improved safety procedures now. The cost may need to be prioritized, but we need policies in place, and we need new habits that will protect us while we're out doing our job. Thanks for this few minutes, and I wish you well.
So if you remember nothing else, this slide, second time we've seen it, you need to understand that the stuff that's at the post-fire scene that you can't see can kill you. It did that to David Creasy, and as the slide said, there are many others who have similar stories, unfortunately. So he talked about policies and procedures and guides. Well, we're going to talk about that too. The first edition of our best practices white paper came out in 2018. The current edition, which you can see the cover here, came out in 2020. This is a peer and technical reviewed guide to how things should be done regarding the post-fire scene in most instances. Now, this isn't like a couple of us just got a good idea and put all this stuff together. You take the time to look at the document, there's a list of the many people who were involved in writing and reviewing the content of this important document. The content was also reviewed by NIOSH, including their personal protective technology laboratory staff. The first edition, we had to just draw a line in the sand because we wanted to get something out. It was about 16 pages. It was a pretty simple document. The current edition has a lot more information. Several slides that you're going to see going forward have the web address IAAI white paper at the bottom. Whether or not you are an IAAI member, we don't care. This link will take you without the need for any passwords and sign in and all that good stuff directly to the resource section for health and safety on the IAAI website, firearson.com. So you can get to all of the resource documents, including this one that we have available for you. But here's just some of the enhancements in this current edition that I got to tell you we're really proud of. The first edition had a lot of good stuff, but like I said, we had to draw a line in the sand somewhere. This one has all of these improvements and enhancements to the overall content of this very important document. So for the next bit, we're going to go through parts of it. We are not covering the entire thing. 41 pages, a lot of stuff, but we're going to scratch the surface of it, dig down a little bit in certain select areas. It's broken down into two main parts. First part is the best practices. That's further broken down: employers, vehicles, individuals, and the individual fire investigators breaks down even further. We're going to spend some time talking about part 2, these protections and protection categories, and then the 3 appendices we'll touch on briefly. So it's certainly important that employers have written policies covering all aspects of fire investigator health and safety. And there are agencies who have used this document as the basis for writing their policies, which is wonderful. We're good with that. There are a lot of policy topics that need to be covered: conducting safety surveys before starting. And, you know, frankly, not only do you need to do that at the beginning, but if you've got a multi-day event, you need to do that at the beginning of every session. You need to talk about the definition of acceptable PPE ensembles, what the requirements are, the use of them, what your written respiratory protection program is. Oh, sorry about that. If you're using SCBA, what's your on-site support mechanism for that? I've been to a lot of fires where the support folks, the big red truck folks, when they're done, they're packing up and they're leaving. They've got other things to do. So if you don't have a way to support SCBA, then you need that. It should address transportation of contaminated tools and equipment, physicals, all sorts of stuff. So let's talk specifically about vehicles for a minute. It's important that nothing that's been contaminated be in the passenger compartment of your vehicle. If you're driving an SUV or a passenger car, sedan, whatever, that's problematic, but it is what it is, right? You can't go to the chief and say, hey, you know, Pauley said you need to buy me a new vehicle. That ain't going to cut it. But if you have those types of vehicles and you can't segregate stuff out, it has to be packaged, it has to be containerized to keep the contaminants out of that area where people are. No contaminated clothing, no contaminated footwear. Keep that stuff out or package it up in sealed containers, tubs, something that protects that environment. If you are fortunate enough to be able to spec a new vehicle, we strongly recommend no cloth seats, no carpeting. You need to be able to wash out and clean the vehicles. If you can, the same noise reducing headsets that are in your fire trucks need to be in your vehicle as well. If you've got radios, if you're on the private side, that doesn't matter. But if you're on the public side, you need to be doing that. You should be carrying a fire extinguisher and a water can with you, if at all possible. That's all good stuff. And again, on the public side, your vehicle should follow NFPA 1901 or a similar best practice document that addresses emergency vehicle safety markings. So the big section then, individual fire investigators. Obviously, you need to be healthy, you need to be fit. Should go without saying. Whatever respirators your agency or company has assigned you, you need to have a fit test to make sure that it works with you. There's a medical procedure with that. We're going to talk about OSHA here in a second. Some of that applies, or some agencies It applies to some not, but that doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do, regardless of whether or not some regulation tells you to do it. It's important if, as you're getting to a scene, if you've got any cuts or abrasions that are already existing on your person, you need to cover those so that they're not getting exposed to further hazards. And it's important to keep some sort of a log so that you know the number of scenes you've been to. I get a lot of questions about this. Why is this important? Well, here's a list of the minimum things that it should do, but it is your record, not your employer's record, your record of the exposures that you have been presented with over your time as a fire investigator going to post-fire scenes. Or if you spent time either previously or concurrently as a firefighter, those are exposures too, right? And you need to be recording and keeping track of all of that. Some folks say, well, my agency does that. Well, that's great. When you retire and say you go leave the public sector, go to the private sector, is that previous employer going to provide you with those records when you need it? The best course of action is for you to keep your own record over and above what any employer may do. Now, if you've been doing this for 20 years and you've been to 500 fires, pick a number, it's going to be virtually impossible to go back and recreate, but you can certainly start. And for folks who are just getting into the business or have only been in a short time, it's much easier to recreate that. If something bad happens to you and you get sick, there are some states, right, that have presumptive laws for folks on the public side. Unfortunately, some of those expect you to point to a specific incident that caused your injury. Well, with this stuff, you can't do that. But if you can show that you've been to X number of fires and exposed to X number of carcinogens, that's going to help you. You can keep it simply as an Excel spreadsheet. And I have a template if you want it. Let me know. Contact information later. But an excellent way to do it is with this link at the bottom, because as part of the federally funded firefighter cancer cohort study, our friends at the University of Miami have created what's called the Personal Exposure Reporter. It's currently the only app. There are a couple others out there, but it's the only one that includes specific data collection for fire investigators. The others do not, and it's free. And when NIOSH gets around to finishing up and turning on their firefighter cancer database, which will include fire investigators, if you choose to, the data that you have collected in the personal exposure reporter can be uploaded to that also. But regardless of how you do it, it's important to keep a record of your exposures. So if something bad happens to you, you have a documented record of it and not just your recollection. Another nice side benefit to this is if you have that record, especially if you've just kept it, like I said, in the Excel spreadsheet or in a logbook, whatever, but you can get it through PER also. You get summoned into court or for a deposition, and one of the attorneys is doing voir dire, and he says, "Oh, Mr. Fire Investigator, how many fire scenes have you been to in your career?" And you say, "Well, sir, I've been to 497 fires." "Really? That's a lot. Can you prove it?" If you've not kept a record, chances are the answer to that is either no, or it's extremely difficult to do. If you have been keeping tracks from day one, or can recreate back to day one for those who can do that, then you have taken a copy of this record with you. And when he says, can you prove it? Or she says, can you prove it? You hand them the list and you have documentation of your experience as a fire investigator. A little bonus benefit to doing that. So we break down in getting to the scene, working the scene, and after the scene. So obviously going to and arriving, it's important to know where you're going and to get there safely, right? That should go without saying. However, we need to say it. It's important to understand the type of scene you're going to, what you're dealing with. If you're on the public side, you need to be checking in with the IC and then communicating regularly with the IC. If you're going to leave the scene and go down the street to conduct an interview, they need to know that, because part of the incident command structure, you're a member of the team, right? And it's important that somebody knows where you are and what you're doing. When you arrive there, part of a good scene safety survey is asking them questions, asking the first in nozzle crew or search crew what they saw, what they experienced, what is there. Utilities, proper PPE, which you put on, don, into the cold zone. We'll talk more about zones in a moment. In the cold zone after you arrive on the scene. Again, we're just scratching the surface here. If you are working a large investigation, I don't care if it's public or private, it makes good sense for you to assign a safety officer, full or part-time, it doesn't matter, but that's one of their duties, to conduct an initial site survey and an ongoing one to assess the types of hazards and the level of hazard. So while you're there, here's a list of just some other little tickler things for you to think about. Just going to touch on a couple of these. It's important for somebody to know where you are and what you're doing. On the public side, it is easier, not always easy, but easier to have multiple people there. Sometimes the firefighters are still there. But frankly, even if the nosy next door neighbor is standing there jabbering in your ear and you're there by yourself, that person may be annoying. However, you fall through a hole in the floor, somebody is there to see that occur and hopefully will call for some assistance. But it's important to have a plan and know, have somebody know where you are. After the incident, it's important, and we're going to go through some of the steps of this here in a moment. This is just an overview. Cleaning the tools. First, your respirator is still on when you're doing that. It's hard for people to get in the practice of doing that, but it is. Nothing. So we're cleaning, doing a gross decon, gross cleaning of your tools, proper procedures to doff your PPE. We're going to cover that in a moment. Cleaning exposed areas and transition areas. What's a transition area? Where your gloves meet your sleeve, the neck, or the biggest ones, the face, the ears, all of these areas that are exposed. The key thing here to remember is that everything that's contaminated gets packaged in one of two ways. If it's disposable stuff that's going in the trash, that gets packaged and can get thrown away later. I'm not a proponent of leaving that stuff at the fire scene. I think that's not a best practice. But if you're taking it with you, it needs to be packaged up. The other half of that is the stuff that is going to get reused. It's going to get cleaned and reused. That needs to be separately packaged and sealed up. Why? Off-gassing continues and particulate spread continues. And none of that stuff should be in the passenger compartment of your vehicle unless that's the only way you can do it and it's packaged and sealed up. If you got an SUV, so one big passenger compartment, and you're just throwing used stuff in the back, it's off-gassing and it's spreading the nanos that you cannot see throughout that passenger compartment, and you're inhaling them. Not good. On the fire service side of things, the shower within the hour rule is important. It is equally important in our world, with the understanding that you can't always do it within an hour. But regardless, you need to do it as soon as possible after you get back to wherever you're going back to, fire station, office, home, whatever, to clean all of those nanos off of you, because they are there, trust me. So we divide fire scenes up in two ways. The first is these fire scene protection categories. You can see the definitions here. We draw some lines in the sand right now at the 2-hour mark and the 72-hour mark. Based on the research that we talked about to some extent and the research that is still needed to some extent, those lines in the sand could move. But they are based on research to date and the beliefs of smart, science-focused people who look at our environment. So those are the two markers that we're going to use now. We divide these up in order to make specific PPE recommendations based on each of these time-based categories. The other half of that is physical. So in this example, we've got a fire scene. We have a structure where a pretend fire has occurred, and that is the hot zone. The warm zone varies in size outside of that based on a number of factors. The size of the fire, the wind direction, play an important role in the size of that warm zone. Earlier, we talked about smoke production during the fire. We all know that occurs. As it goes up into the atmosphere, based on a number of factors, it cools down and particulate matter falls to the ground outside of the hot zone at that structure. What's included in that cooled smoke? It is particulate matter, also known as soot. The warm zone includes, on the downwind side predominantly, what I like to call the soot print area outside of the structure. When you walk through that area, likely unbeknownst to you, but maybe you can tell, you are stirring up the particulates, no different than if you're walking inside the structure and you are making them airborne, and you're getting them on your clothing, on your person, which means that you need to be wearing PPE in that area. There needs to be, in most cases, a dedicated identified pathway between the cold zone and the hot zone. And depending on the type of fire that you're doing, you may need perimeter security around the outer edge of the warm zone to ensure that access is limited. About 2 years ago now, don't hold me to that, but about 2 years ago, Palm Beach, Florida Fire and Rescue, along with our friends at the University of Miami, did a study of the hazards in the warm zone, those hazards that we've just talked about. As a result of that, that agency now requires any of their members operating in the warm zone to wear respiratory protection. Who does that typically include? Pump operators on the fire trucks, your RIT crews, your incident commanders, your safety officers, could be any of these folks, could be others. But respiratory protection in the warm zone is equally as important as in the hot. So the warm zone includes the area immediately outside the hot zone, of a sufficient size and shape to limit exposure to contaminants, and includes the necessary decon areas if you're doing those. Access to this area needs to be limited. The only people that should be in the warm zone, easier said than done, I understand, but the only people that should be in there is your decon personnel and people accessing the hot zone. So this just breaks down the hot, the warm, and the cold, gives you a little example of those three. So at the end of the day, your post-fire scene includes the category, those are time-based, and the zone type, which are distance-based. So in your head, you need to understand, imagine, and determine the category, the zone, which gives you your post-fire scene. I am not here to tell you that you must wear full 100% PPE in every fire scene. That ain't going to happen because every fire scene is different. But here in the US, many of us have to work under OSHA regulations. Even if you don't, they're good to follow. And they say the PPE must be selected that will protect employees from the specific hazards which they are likely to encounter during their work at a work site. Well, we just spent the last hour and a half or so talking about the specific hazards that you are likely to encounter. That tells you that in most instances, you need to be wearing some PPE. Let's talk a second about these pictures. Gentleman in the upper left is Harry homeowner. It's his house. Is he adequately dressed for it? No, but it's his house. You have taken him in with you to show him stuff, whatever. He's got good shoes on. If he had flip-flops or something on, I would not have him in there, but this is likely the only fire scene that he's ever going to be in. So barring anything happening to give him an acute injury, chronic health issues as a result of being in here for a few minutes, looking around with you, is likely not an issue. The gentleman in the lower left, he's a fire investigator. How do we know that? Well, his shirt says so. He's got a helmet on. That's nice. He does not have gloves on, I don't think. And he certainly does not have respiratory protection. He's wearing a short sleeve shirt, which gives him dermal exposure issues. Chief Creasy talked about that. Gentleman in the bottom right is doing a vehicle exam. If he's so outside, well ventilated, he's not disturbing the scene, he's not stirring up particulate matter. He's wearing coveralls, he's wearing boots, he's wearing gloves. He has no respirator. I'm okay with that. Once he starts digging, though, he's stirring up particulate matter, nanos, and he needs to be wearing a respirator. The folks in the upper right are well protected for digging out a scene. Boots, gloves, coveralls, respirator, helmet, the whole nine. So there is no, and there cannot be any hard and fast, thou shalt wear XYZ at every fire scene. That every fire scene is different. However, as you see here, basic precautions are necessary at most every one. And here's a list of those. We will talk about some of them. We will not hit all of those. Briefly, the pictures again. Top guy, well protected. The far left one, also well protected. The fella in the middle, I've got it's nice that he's wearing boots and gloves and Tyvek. He has no respirator on, and you can still see smoke emanating from the fire scene. He's breathing in all of the gases, vapors, the nanos that are at that scene, no respiratory protection. Picture on the right, honestly, is an IAAI training picture that we took that shows a fully dressed for a cold fire scene fire investigator. If you're wearing everything you need, worst case scenario, if you will, or best case, that's what you need to look like. I want to talk about the two bottom pictures for a minute. Both of these pictures were taken at a facility where a detailed lab exam, what we call a joint exam on the private side of a vehicle that had been the cause of a residential structure fire. Folks came home, parked the car in a two-car carport, so it's open on three sides and attached to the house, burned up the carport, burned up the house. The vehicle was packaged, taken to this facility for a later exam. So the folks in that bottom right picture, it's nice that at least three of them are wearing Tyvek. A couple are not, but I guarantee you that the footwear that every one of those folks is wearing is the same footwear that they wore into the building in the morning and are wearing home in the afternoon. That footwear is grossly contaminated with particulate matter. And when they get back in their vehicle, they are spreading that particulate to their vehicle, taking it back to their office, back to home, whatever. The folks in the other bottom picture, that when this company packaged up this vehicle, they then swept / shoveled up all of the debris that had been around the vehicle and put it into these black plastic tubs. Now, the first problem is the employees that were doing that were wearing no respiratory protection, no PPE whatsoever. Got a big issue with that. Interestingly, about 2/3 of the fire investigators who were there moved well away while they were doing that. But this company was not taking care of those employees. So then we have this joint exam weeks later, and two of the employees of this particular company have now opened up these tubs and are sifting through them, looking for pieces, parts. No respiratory protection, lots of nanos being released into the environment of that structure. Very, very bad. So let's drill down on some of this PPE just very briefly. So here are some examples of eye, foot, head protection. If you're wearing a half face piece respirator, you should be wearing goggles. We talked earlier about ocular absorption, absorbing gases and nanos in through your eye sockets. Needs to be protected. Your feet need to be protected with something that, one, doesn't go back in the passenger compartment of your vehicle post-fire, but has a steel shank on the bottom, steel toe. There's pluses and minuses to leather versus rubber. Rubber boots can pick up static electricity that'll attract particulates, but they're easier to clean. Leather, on the other hand, can absorb certain chemicals and can be harder to clean. It's best to have one of each with you if you can, and then determine the appropriate one to use based on the scene that you find. But either one is good. Something you got to be wearing, right? Any chance of stuff falling on your noggin, you should be wearing a helmet. The helmet should have a chin strap. The chin strap should be used. It doesn't do you any good if the chin strap is not secured. You climb up a ladder, you fall off, you fall backwards. By the time you land on the ground, that helmet is not on your head, most likely. The goal with skin protection is to cover as much of your skin as possible to limit dermal absorption possibilities. Picture here is of a Tyvek suit. They've changed their designations, so they're now numbers. The 400, if you're buying their brand, there are other brands, but if you're buying their brand, the 400 is the minimum for particulates. It does not work with gases and vapors, but you also need to understand that this is only going to protect you down to about 3 microns. As we've previously talked about, there's smaller stuff that's out there that's not good for you. But unless you go to a level A suit, this is about it. Even structural PPE is not going to protect you, and it's not going to protect you from vapors. But you need to be wearing something. Cover it up, put it on when you get there, take it off before you leave, package it up. Hand protection is good. Nitrile is generally better than leather, or I'm sorry, than latex. Disposable leather gloves are good for a secondary layer. If you're using those, these go in your trash bag when you're done. If you're wearing reusable, like structure fire gloves, something like that, that's great. But they need to be cleaned. And if you're not going to clean them after every use, which can be a little challenging, they need to be kept somewhere where they're not spreading nanos around. So we're going to watch another video. This is the second of 2 videos, a little over 4 minutes. This is a training video from the Mesa Fire and Medical Department in Mesa, Arizona. This is an internal, or developed for them internally for their fire investigators. And it's about a year and a half or so old now. So it is agency specific, but it gives good information about protecting one's self in the post-fire environment. Captain Mike Brewer will introduce himself. He is one of the members of our Health and Safety Committee.
I'm Captain Mike Brewer with Mesa Fire and Medical Department, Fire Prevention and Investigations Captain. We're here with Safety Captain Greg Adams. We're going to talk a little bit today about the use of PPE in contaminated environments due to smoke. So what we're going to talk about today is the use of Tyvek suits and SCBAs in the proper format to prevent and minimize risk to exposure of carcinogens that are in fire smoke. All right, so the Tyvek suits come into 2 different sizes we will have available. If you need anything larger than a 2X, then we'll have to make sure that we supply those to you. You want to start off putting this ensemble in a clean environment away from the fire smoke, and you'll start off with putting on your gloves and then moving to putting on the Tyvek suit, which will require you to take off your boots. Then you will step into your preferably rubber structure boots. He also has the Tyvek tucked inside of his rubber boots. The rubber boots are easily decontaminated post-fire event. Depending on what Tyvek suit you're wearing, they do have thumb wristlets to keep the Tyvek suit covering your wrist area. They do also have a moisture barrier sealed along the neck cuff as well as along the front zipper area. Much like getting dressed in your turnouts, you put your hood on over your head and then pull it back down prior to putting on your SCBA mask. This will be that same procedure. And then pull that hood back over to cover your hair and your neck area prior to putting on your helmet. This ensemble is to protect us in contaminated environments that are not considered to be IDLH. It's not to be worn during salvage and overhaul operations. Those environments will primarily be structure fires, post-fire extinguishment during the fire investigation and scene support activities. We typically get exposed 4 different ways. You can get exposed with absorption, inhalation, ingestion, or injection. The 2 most common exposures for us are absorption as well as ingestion when we go to rehab and we're eating snacks after a fire with contaminated hands. So the decon process is going to take care of that, but this is for our fire investigators, our scene support folks. We want to make sure that they're wearing the proper PPE to minimize risk. The Tyvek suit itself provides particulate barrier down to 3 microns, which is also the same as our N95 masks. We don't promote using the N95 masks because you can still absorb through your eyes. So we don't want those gases to be absorbed and those particulates to be absorbed through your eyes, which is why we recommend wearing the SCBA in any contaminated environment. As many of you know, historically we've gone into contaminated environments dressed a lot like this. We can still smell smoke in our clothing. The first time I wore a Tyvek suit and came home after a fire investigation, my wife couldn't smell the smoke on me after I took a shower, which was a big attest to why we are doing this. It does protect us down for those particulate matters. It does not protect any vapor or gases, which is why we promote the use of an SCBA. The N95 mask, you may not smell smoke because it's filtering out those particulates. However, you're still ingesting and inhaling the hydrogen cyanide and the carbon monoxide, which are gases, and that does not protect us from the gases. Nothing that we have protects us from the gases other than a level A suit. So that's why we are switching to this. We want to protect our members. We've obviously cancer in the fire service has gone exponentially or grown exponentially, and we want to do everything we can to minimize our risk of exposure to carcinogens in the Mesa Fire and Medical Department so that we can serve not only our customers with care, but also each other with care. Thank you very much.
So you are likely familiar with this graphic showing the hierarchy of controls. It was developed by NIOSH. It's widely used. And it talks about, you should try illumination first, then working your way down, and PPE is a last line of protection. Unfortunately, at many fire scenes, reducing hazards through these other control measures other than PPE to the point where PPE is not needed just is not going to occur. In the current edition, the 2021 edition of NFPA 921, there is new language that says in part, and it's section 13.6.1 if you're interested. It says, quote, although generally considered one of the least effective control measures, wearing proper PPE may be the only of the available control measures. The only one of the available control measures that is efficient due to the nature of fire investigations. So while it's important to, in doing your risk assessment, to be able to consider these other control methodologies, at the end of the day, likely the only one that's going to work for you is PPE. So let's talk specifically about respiratory protection equipment. First of all, it has to be adequate and it has to be appropriate, right? Right for the hazard and effectively reduce your exposure to the carcinogens, to the particulate matter, to the vapors, gases, all that good stuff to protect your health. It has to be right for you, which means fit testing for the right size. It has to be right for the task and the environment. If you need SCBA, wearing something less than that is not appropriate. And you have to be able to work freely without causing other risks and protections. So in the US, the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration regulations, apply to all private sector workers. They apply to most federal employees, not everyone, but the vast majority. But it does not typically cover state and local workers. Now, some states can opt to have their own program approved by OSHA, and those are called state plans. But if you have a state plan, it's required that it covers state and local government. So there are 22 states here in the US that have those. And there are 6 other states and the US Virgin Islands that have OSHA approved programs specifically for state and local government workers only. So this means to us that we're talking about roughly half the US public employees and most private company employers are covered. Now, while these are minimum regs, even if they don't apply to you, if you're not one of these covered, why wouldn't you still follow them, right? You need to be doing something that is effective, and these provide good recommendations at the very least. But if you are covered by OSHA, and there are similar regulations in other countries for our international viewers, the UK has their HSA, other countries have similar. So, but even if you're not required to follow that, it just makes good sense, especially the second part of this slide. You cannot have facial hair that inhibits the seal of the face piece. So if it applies, it's regulatory, which means your agency or company can be fined, but it just makes good sense. So NIOSH has a lot of documentation and a lot of language regarding respiratory protection selection. They even have a tool, an online tool that helps you with that. Unfortunately, in order for that to work, you need to know what the specific hazard is. Well, in the post-fire environment, you can't do that because there's tons of them, and their tool wants you to pick one. So the folks who have put together the best practices document that we've been talking about, have developed a minimum respirator assembly for you to use. Now, don't get confused by the zones and the scenes, right? Remember what those differences are. I know there's a lot of words here, but to make it effective, we need to have the words. So P100, P does not mean particulate. It means oil proof. But 100 is catching 100% of the particulate matter down to 3 microns. NIOSH does not use the term HEPA, high efficiency particulate air filter. They don't use that term, but that's essentially what this is, down to 3 microns. It includes, so that's your filter. It includes a cartridge that gets attached to that. I'll show you some pictures here in a minute if you're not familiar. That gives you protection for oily vapors, organic vapors, acid gases, and formaldehyde. We added the formaldehyde protection in the second edition based on feedback from some of the public folks, especially Phoenix, and some of the studies that showed the persistence of formaldehyde in the near post-fire environment. Certainly applies more to the public folks than the private folks, but I will tell you with the particular brand that I use, there's no difference in the price between the two, and when you add the formaldehyde, it's covering a whole litany of other things as well. But these 3 at a minimum need to be doing. There are certain criteria where you can use the Seaburn canister, and we talk about that. The Appendix A of our best practices document fully addresses respiratory protection guidelines, including for other countries. So again, this is an overview. I strongly encourage you to get that document, read the document. That Appendix A is 5 or 6 pages of material that covers all of these recommendations in great detail. But the important thing to point out here, in addition, is the red text at the bottom. There's a lot of other stuff that's out there, some of which is touted for fire investigators, that does not meet these recommendations. And if it's not approved by NIOSH, that's a problem. It needs to be. So here's an example. This is what recommended respiratory protection equipment looks like. We've got a half face piece on the left, a full on the right. You can see, so the filters and cartridges are colorized here in the US. So a magenta filter tells you that it's P100, and the cartridge, the multi cartridge, is going to be either yellow or olive, what I call olive drab, an off yellow color, depending on the protections. If you're doing formaldehyde, it's going to be the olive drab off yellow thing. Have to be NIOSH compliant. They have to say, the paperwork has to say that. N95 is not acceptable in our world. They have to be applicable and suitable for the purpose for which they are designed and the environment that you are going into. If you are following OSHA regulations, you have to have a qualified program administrator and decision maker who knows what they're talking about to make the best choices based on the hazards, and you have to have a written respiratory protection policy. So here are just some pictures, some graphics of the different options for you. SCBA on the left. Now, these are just 3M pictures that I used with their permission. These have P100 filters only. They do not have gas cartridges attached, right? So just keep that in mind. But you've got a full face, a half face. The one in the bottom center is called a PAPR, which is a powered air purifying respirator, where the half and the full are just air purifying respirators. But the N95 mask, and I will tell you that I go to fire scenes today and I've seen people leaving N95s laying around it. And if that's all you've got, I'm sorry, but something's better than nothing. But it really is not adequate for what we are doing. So what about other fires? Well, at the end of the day, there's no difference. The particulate matter, the nanos from a vehicle fire, are just as bad for you as a residential structure fire. And if you're doing vessel fires, boat fires, oh my gosh, the fiberglass particulate matter, that is some nasty stuff. You really need to wear a level A for those. I mean, they're that bad. Not saying you should, but good PPE, covering up as much of yourself as you can. Respiratory protection, really important when you're doing a boat fire. Wildland fires, there's an EPA study from 2017 that looked at what they call biomass smoke. In other words, natural materials in the wildland fire environment. Bottom line is there's a distinct increase in lung toxicity and what they call mutagenicity, which means anything that can increase the frequency of mutation in an organism. Increased levels from the inhalation of biomass smoke. So if you're doing a wildland fire investigation, you need to be wearing protection. In some cases, there are some special decon considerations. We talk about this in the document. Just going to briefly touch on it here. So to raise your awareness up a notch or two, if you're not already. Crime scenes, fatal fires, there's specific processes for people going into and exiting that scene that you need to be following. But it's important for you to have proper decon and doffing procedures when you come out, whether you're public or private, it doesn't matter. Appendix B in best practices covers this in detail. There are separate procedures based on the zone. Those are time-based, right? Based on the fire zone. So hot zone A and B, which is predominantly your public fire investigators, not always, but most of the time. And then the warm and cold, which could be any of us, right? And we break down the procedures. There's some slight variations. We're going to talk about the first part today, the hot AB, but you can read about all of this in the document for the more detailed stuff. There's slight differences, right? But regardless of what you're doing, as it notes here at the bottom, and we talked about before, it's very important. This is gross decon. Getting most of the stuff off. When you are done and get back to wherever it is you're going, it's really important for you to shower just as soon as possible to get all the other stuff off. So the first thing when you come out, the natural tendency, and I know this, I've done this, it's very hard to train yourself not to do it. Typically, the first thing that pops off is the respirator. Don't do that. There's off-gassing, there's particulate matter that's getting strewn all over the place. Leave the respirator on. Get your tools cleaned, either clean them yourself or pass them. If you've got a decon station set up where other people are doing the tools, those folks need to be wearing respiratory protection, gloves at the very least, and preferably as much of their skin covered as possible. I saw a setup not too long ago where they were doing a nice job of cleaning all this stuff. And they're doing the gross wash off of the people and the tools, but all of the contaminated water is running down across the parking lot to where a bunch of firefighters had doffed their turnout, and it was all laying in the parking lot and it was all getting wet. Not ideal. So there's specific procedures that you need to follow, an order of doffing, taking off, right? The outer gloves, the helmet, if you're wearing one, which you should be if you're in an A or B, whatever, hood, and there's a special way to do that, a certain way to do that. All of this stuff, the respirator is still on. If you're going to dispose of any cloths that you have wiped up, wipes or whatever, they go in the trash. If they're something that you're going to wash and reuse, then they go in a separate bag, but all of that stuff gets packaged up, right? Then the boots, then the outerwear and the outer stuff. Boots get cleaned. Goggles, if you've had them, if you're wearing a full, then that doesn't apply, obviously. Then the respirator comes off. That stays on until this step because you're off-gassing and you're strewing all these particulates around. Then all the stuff gets packaged up. Then you're wiping yourself down or washing yourself down, especially considering the transition areas. Then you're putting on something else to travel. You're not wearing any outerwear back into your vehicle. Remember my shoe story, right? You're changing footwear. You're putting all this stuff on separate when you get there and taking all this stuff off before you leave. If you need to carry other clothes with you, that's wonderful. But we're not wearing the same stuff that we wore into the fire. So just an overview there. So here, just in summary, here's 5 things that I don't care what your policy is or your agency or your company, here are 5 things that you personally can do to protect yourself. Good PPE, proper respiratory protection, cleaning everything, keeping all your stuff packaged up so you're not spreading the nanos around anywhere else. Make sure to do that secondary cleaning properly of all your gear, your tools, and keeping that exposure log. A lot of people don't seem to grasp that. It's just a very important component of what we're talking about. Specifically regarding cleaning, here's just some quick reminders on that. If you're cleaning your respirator, alcohol wipes is not the way to go, but follow the manufacturer's recommendations. Typically it's soap and water. And again, clean your body. Take a shower as soon as you can. Not after you've had dinner with the fam, not the next morning, whatever, as soon as you can. So we talked about this in the beginning of the presentation. Now we're talking about it here towards almost the end here. So I would hope that by now you all understand and know the answer to this question. Very simply, it's no. There's a ton of hazards in the post-fire environment, and a cold fire scene based on time, right? More than 72 hours, not showing any visible signs, the definitions we talked about, but you need to be protecting yourself. So in summary, as we wind down here, you need to understand what hazards are present at every fire scene. Every scene is different. And how do you do that? You talk to people, you ask questions, you look around and do a site safety assessment before starting anything. Then you need to be able to recognize the hazards that you're seeing. If you can eliminate them, that's wonderful. If you can mitigate them, that's wonderful. Recognizing that these may not be possible. Regardless of any of that, proper PPE for the situation. And please remember, nanos are present at every post-fire scene. That scene's a week old. That stuff's all settled down. As soon as you walk into the scene, the warm area, the hot area, you're stirring that stuff up. If you're there on the private side and the insurance adjuster has met you there and he or she is like, I just need to go in and take a quick couple of photos, they're stirring that stuff up. They're making it hazardous for you when you go in. So here, just a couple final thoughts here as we wrap up. Yes, there are what I call the one and done people, but there are plenty of other folks, and this is just a partial list, who are at a lot of post-fire scenes. Now that you are more knowledgeable and more educated regarding the health and safety hazards of the post-fire environment, rhetorical question, do you have a responsibility to educate these folks? This is just a partial list. I'm sure you've experienced many of these. Do you have an accelerant detection dog or a cadaver dog? Are you cleaning? Are you doing a gross decon of that dog before you put it back into your vehicle after it's walked through the fire scene and has nanoparticulates all over its fur? Just something for you to think about. Tell you quickly about this picture here. Training, Florida chapter IAAI a couple years ago. They're doing some live burns. Good stuff. But the attendees, wearing street clothes, as you can see here, were allowed to walk through the burn cell. So this person in particular has got particulate matter all over their shoes. They're going to walk back into the hotel, and there were probably 50 people just like this gentleman. They're tracking all of that back in. Just something to think about. Protections and training are just as important as protections at the fire scene. So at the end of the day, we need to have a safety culture change within our profession. And how do we do that? Well, if you're a boss at any level, then this pertains to you. This information, and on the next slide, is taken from an article that this gentleman wrote on changing the safety culture. You need to look at your process, looking at things from a business perspective. Is it cheaper to buy PPE and give it to everybody, and oh, by the way, require them to use it, than it is for paying for the health coverage, all the hospital bills and the doctor bills and all of that? Yeah, you may have insurance for it, but I guarantee you your rates are going to take a big jump. The process here is important as the outcome. If you don't have good processes, right, you're back to normalization of deviance that we talked about. You have to be able to anticipate the risks that your employees and your folks, your coworkers, are going to experience or could experience. Transformation starts at the top. It then flows through the managers to the workers. But the success for these changes start at the bottom. And regardless of what your entities, your employers, policies are, you can still do this stuff on your own. You don't need a written policy from your employer to tell you what to do, because you are now educated, you are now more knowledgeable and understand what it is that you should be doing. So just do it yourself. So having a personal safety culture is good. Setting examples for others is good. And as the green here says, and I really love this saying, I can't take credit for it, but when you get criticized for doing the right thing, it's still the right thing to do. A couple of years ago at the IAAI's International Training Conference, the Monday morning speaker was Elizabeth McCormick, motivational speaker. I believe she was like the first female Black Hawk helicopter pilot in the Army. I believe that's correct. But anyhow, she was facing a tough crowd. Monday morning, bunch of fire investigators didn't want to hear a motivational speaker, trust me. But the one thing that stuck with me is her statement here. You are responsible for your future. I would hope that those of you who are supervisors or managers or in some sort of a leadership role within your agency or company understand the seriousness now of this issue, and that you update policies and procedures accordingly. But even if your agency doesn't acknowledge this problem at all, that doesn't mean that you can't have a personal safety culture, because at the end of the day, you and you alone are responsible for your own safety. That is the end of our presentation. I thank you very much for spending some time with us. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you so much. Truly valuable information. The person that put me in touch with you was Dixon Robin. He's one of our national response team leaders. And I went on a couple of call outs in Oakland, California. And he was doing an initial assessment of it was an apartment building that had been set on fire. We would eventually find that out. But during his initial assessment, he came down from the podium and of this building. And the one thing that stuck in my head that he told me was during our safety briefing, it says, it smells like cancer up there, so you might want to wear your respirator. So that,
I love it.
That has stuck with me. And, just like the quote that you had there from the Black Hawk pilot about, our future is, is based on our decisions. I mean, that's just, no truer words have been spoken. So I really appreciate your time, Jeff. We are going to have a test available. And in that test, the students will be allowed to submit questions, and I'll get those questions to you prior to us doing a live session. So we really appreciate your time, Jeff, and we'll bring you back for a live Q&A. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for having me.
You bet.